Manny Man does history.
North America had been colonized by Europeans. 13 of these colonies declared their independence from Britain in 1776, becoming the United States of America. The colonies north of the USA were known as Canada and remained under British control. Some Canadians were exiles from the States still loyal to Britain, and some others were French-speaking from a previous French colony lost to Britain. The Canadas prospered because of a very profitable fur trade. After the USA defeated Britain, USA was granted extra land west of their colonies, already inhabited by Native American nations, some who had historically been pushed west already. Many of these Native Americans believed in an independent nation, an Indian confederacy, many tribes having united under the leadership of Tecumseh and his brother. American expansionism was already well underway as they bought French Louisiana from Napoleonic France. Following the French Revolution, France ended up with an emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, and the rest of the monarchies of Europe went to war against him, which became the Napoleonic Wars. Britain was one of these nations and prided themselves in naval superiority. Since their independence, the USA had built itself an impressive navy of its own, and amidst the Napoleonic Wars, the USA remained neutral. Britain struggled to keep its crew numbers for its ships. Some British sailors even fled to America to escape being press-ganged into the British Navy. The British did not like this, and the British Navy vessels began stopping and searching American ships for British deserters, even refusing to recognise British subjects becoming citizens of the USA. In 1807, the British warship HMS Leopard attacked and boarded the USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. American merchant ships were also captured and cargo was seized as contraband by the British, despite American neutrality. All of this angered many Americans, and US President Thomas Jefferson laid on the Embargo Act of 1807, refusing to go to war against the British again. Tensions were rising against the British as they armed the natives and supported raids and indeed Tecumseh's war on the States, trying to stop USA expanding into the Canadas. And some Americans looked to the Canadas as their means of war. The added prospect of annexing the Canadas to the United States was a bonus. US forces outnumbered British forces in North America, but the British forces were better trained. While Britain was distracted by the Napoleonic Wars, now was the time. The new British Prime Minister tried to talk things out with the US, but the message was so long crossing the Atlantic. The United States Congress voted in favour of a declaration of war against Britain, the first of its kind, overseen by President James Madison. The declaration formally came into action on June 18, 1812, beginning the war. The initial war concentrated on pressure points around the Great Lakes. Anti-British sentiment was strongest in the frontier territories, as they were the most affected by the British-supported native tribal raids. William Hull led an American army into Upper Canada from Detroit on the 12th of July, declaring to British subjects who don't surrender, "The horrors and calamities of war will stalk before you." Former President Thomas Jefferson believed the war would be easy, simply a matter of marching. In truth, many Canadians were loyal to the British Empire. French-speaking Canadians worried as well that the USA would bring too many changes in politics, religion, and language. The US had a huge shipyard in Sackett's Harbour, upstate New York, to control Lake Ontario. The British attacked it, but were repelled. Major General Sir Isaac Brock had been readying troops and militia in Upper Canada in the event of a war with USA. When the declaration of war arrived, the Canadians were ready. British forces advanced into northern Michigan and easily overpowered US forces who were still unaware of their own government's declaration. Allied with the Native American tribes, the British moved on Fort Mackinac. British forces mounted a gun against the fort, fired one shot, and the Americans surrendered. Hearing this news, William Hull quickly withdrew his inexperienced forces back to Detroit. Isaac Brock took the opportunity to move British forces on Fort Malden in Amherstburg, south of Detroit. More natives rallied in support of the British as they captured Fort Malden along the Detroit River, giving them control of the area and indeed also the fur trade. The fur must flow. Isaac Brock linked up with Tecumseh as they prepared to capture Detroit. In the Illinois Territory, American soldiers and civilians evacuated Fort Dearborn, where the city of Chicago stands today. The Potawatomi natives were under the impression they were getting the leftover supplies, but the Americans burned all the supplies, so while en route to Fort Wayne, there were attacks by young Potawatomi men. Most of the Americans were killed, the rest were captured. This brief battle would have long-lasting consequences for the Native Americans. Meanwhile, Isaac Brock and Tecumseh's forces marched on Detroit in a show of strength. They successfully psyched out the superiorly numbered American forces who feared a massacre, so the Americans surrendered Fort Detroit. Most of the British Navy was busy keeping Napoleonic France at bay. The ships they could spare blockaded the American coast, putting pressure on trade. Most engagements with the US Navy were single duels. Days after the capture of Detroit, the USS Constitution duelled the HMS Guerriere out on the Atlantic. Constitution's strong hull repelled some cannonballs, earning it the nickname Old Ironsides. The US Navy was very successful in these duels. Brock travelled to the east of Lake Erie as American forces amassed for a second invasion. Lieutenant General George Prevost had organised an armistice in the hope that peace could be discussed, but it didn't last. In October, the Americans tried to invade across the Niagara River, but were defeated at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Isaac Brock was killed during the battle, and Canadian leadership suffered a great loss. Major General Roger Hale Sheaffe assumed command. In early 1813, in the harsh winter, American General William Henry Harrison planned to retake Detroit, but James Winchester prematurely marched to Frenchtown for supplies and suffered a massive defeat. Some of the poorly guarded prisoners were massacred by natives. The St. Lawrence River marked the northeast frontier between USA and Upper Canada. Sneaky trade was done across the border in the early days of the war, but the Americans tried to clamp down on this with raids during the winter, which ultimately led to Canadians attacking and capturing Ogdensburg to secure their supply lines. On April 27th, US forces led a massive attack across Lake Ontario on York, the capital of Upper Canada, today known as Toronto. The Americans overwhelmed the British, but at great cost. The US burnt down the Parliament building, the library, and looted the city. The Canadians would remember this, and they would have their vengeance. Luckily for the British, Kingston was the more strategically important place for them. Towards the end of May, American forces captured Fort George on the Niagara River. British forces abandoned Fort Erie, retreating to the Burlington Heights, leaving Upper Canada in a very precarious position. The British attacked Sackett's Harbour again, but failed to capture or destroy it. In Boston Harbour, a vicious 15-minute duel occurred in which the HMS Shannon captured the USS Chesapeake by killing many of the enemy crew. It was a particularly bloody engagement. Meanwhile, back on the Niagara Peninsula, the British mounted a surprise night attack at the Battle of Stony Creek, halting the American advance. Mistakenly fearing they were outnumbered, the Americans pulled back to Fort George. In June, the Battle of Beaver Dams saw natives and British forces halting the final advance of the US into Upper Canada. The Canadians hadn't the forces to retake Fort George, so they decided to starve out the Americans. Meanwhile, by Lake Erie, Procter and Tecumseh's forces moved against the newly built Fort Meigs, but failed to capture it. Tecumseh did stop native warriors as they were massacring American prisoners in Fort Miami, while Procter did nothing. They tried to take Fort Meigs again, but failed. Then they tried to take Fort Stephenson, but failed. Tecumseh grew wary of Procter. Their supply lines got cut off as American ships took up positions on Lake Erie, so Procter and Tecumseh fell back to the Detroit River. In the southern states, warring factions of Muskogee natives escalated into the Creek War, with the US fighting the Red Stick Muskogee. The Fort Mims massacre, in which Red Stick Muskogees captured Fort Mims along the Alabama River and killed hundreds of its inhabitants, including civilians, got the US government involved in the war. This war not only had British involvement, but Spanish involvement too. In September, 9 US ships on Lake Erie defeated and captured 6 British Royal Navy vessels, ensuring American control on one of the Great Lakes, so the British evacuated Fort Detroit and Fort Malden. As Harrison's forces pushed their advantage, they were victorious at the Battle of the Thames, in which Tecumseh was killed. The Indian Confederacy crumbled without his leadership. Capturing Montreal would have been very effective for the Americans, but an invasion attempt in October was repelled by well-placed Canadian and native defenders. As the Canadian winter set in, the Americans abandoned Fort George in December and, on the way home, set fire to Newark, leaving the villagers to freeze in the snow. The British captured Fort Niagara and burnt down Lewiston in retaliation. The British, along with Mohawk allies, pursued the survivors through the snow. Tuscaroras stepped in defence of the fleeing civilians. It was not a peaceful Christmas. Just before the new year, the British burnt Buffalo in New York. In April 1814, Napoleon was defeated in Europe, so Britain was now able to concentrate a little more on that pesky war with the Americans, and indeed send reinforcements across the Atlantic. General George Prevost, backed by 15,000 British reinforcements, was ordered to take control of the Great Lakes. This resulted in a fairly lacklustre race of shipbuilding on Lake Ontario between the British and Americans, which amounted to very little. During British blockades and raids on the southern states, many enslaved people escaped and were freed. Many resettled in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Some even joined the British forces, taking up arms against their former slave owners. The Americans had gotten their act together and were on the attack. In July, they captured Fort Erie under General Winfield Scott. Canadian forces under General Phineas Riall arrived too late and were brutally defeated at the Battle of Chippewa. Americans pushed on but were stopped at Lundy's Lane near Niagara Falls. The battle was inconclusive, but the Americans were now outnumbered, so they fell back to Fort Erie. They withstood a British siege, even repelling several massive direct assaults. In the southern states, General Andrew Jackson led the US to victory against the Upper Creek Red Sticks. The resulting treaty led to more Muskogee territory being ceded to the USA. The war with Britain had been putting massive pressure on everyone's economies, so peace negotiations between Britain and the USA began in Ghent in Flanders. But that didn't stop them from planning new invasions. In August 1814, British forces under General Robert Ross and General Sir George Cockburn pushed right up through Chesapeake Bay towards the US capital, Washington. They defeated American forces at Bladensburg and pressed their advantage against the capital. US President Madison and many others evacuated the city as the British approached. They captured the city and burnt the White House, the Capitol building, and many other public buildings. Shortly after, a powerful storm hit the city and the British ultimately pulled back to their ships. It was the only time the United States capital city has ever been held by a foreign power. Soon after, the British moved on the city of Baltimore, but were unable to capture it. The bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem that would become the Star-Spangled Banner, later the American national anthem. From Lower Canada, General Prevost led a force to outside of Plattsburgh, but held back on attacking, insisting on waiting for Navy forces to take control of Lake Champlain. He forced the HMS Confiance into a premature attack, resulting in British defeat on the water. Prevost then withdrew completely. The British higher-ups were furious, and he would later return to London and prepare for a court-martial. British forces invaded northern Massachusetts, which would later become Maine. They held many positions there till the end of the war. The brand new HMS St. Lawrence was armed to the teeth and ensured British control of Lake Ontario for the rest of the war. As winter approached, the Americans in Fort Erie retreated and destroyed the fort. Down south, Jackson moved his forces to attack the British and Spanish in Pensacola, Florida, for arming the Red Sticks. He then moved his forces to New Orleans to fortify the city, as British naval forces increased attacks on the southern coast. Meanwhile, in Ghent, the British were demanding control of the Great Lakes and an Indian barrier state in the northwest, which they would sponsor and hopefully hold back American expansionism. The Americans were having none of it. The Duke of Wellington suggested that Britain wasn't in a good position to make such demands and should politely go back to the status quo. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December 1814 and proposed no border changes between Canada and the United States. Word of the peace treaty spread slowly. The British assault on New Orleans went ahead in January 1815, but American forces successfully repelled it. Word eventually came of the treaty, and all forces withdrew from occupied territories. And thus the War of 1812 ended in 1815. America's economy actually came out better off in this war, with many banks having been set up to fund the war. Many factories were opened due to the British-shaped gap in the market during the war, which really helped kickstart America's Industrial Revolution. General Prevost died before his court-martial in London. As disastrous as the end of his career was, he did hold off American conquest. Some American military leaders would go on to become president. William Henry Harrison would become the shortest-lasting US president. Andrew Jackson, while as president, would force out the natives in the southern states in the Trail of Tears. Besides minor border issues, the United States and Canada would remain at peace with each other, even sharing territory for a while during the 19th century, as they both expanded across North America. America and Britain would become close allies into the 20th century. The War of 1812 remains a strange episode in North American history. Many Americans say they won it, many Canadians say they won it. The natives most certainly lost. One thing is for sure, this war awoke America's desire for a strong military. They never again wanted to be caught unawares, and beyond a war with Mexico came the grueling American Civil War, fighting over states' rights to enslave people. The 20th century saw the USA's military grow to become the largest in the world. Canada chose a slightly more chilled approach.
Ba-bum.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars